All right. Welcome, my friends, to the Equity and Mathematics Roundtable discussion. In my small sphere of influence to advance educational equity, I came up with a plan for accelerating students to complete 3 years of math in 2. This plan is called AMP, or the Accelerated Math Plan. AMP was meant to be to level the playing field for all students. It was meant to be an opportunity for all students to show what they know and open the door to advanced math programs in middle and high school. My charge now is to increase participation from 74 schools to all of our elementary schools. I believe all students should have the chance to shoot for the moon. When this discussion was planned back in January, the topic of equity was centered around AMP and the need for all students to have an opportunity for an entry point into this accelerated learning. I now realize the conversation needs to be opened up to racial equity and social justice in all math classrooms. Where this conversation was needed in January, it is even more so now. I fear that this barrier for many of our students is the almighty test score and the one-size-fits-all test prep culture that surrounds it. High-stakes tests are just one measure of student thinking. I do not have the solutions to these problems, nor do I think that this panel is going to save the world today. But I will paraphrase a quote from Maya Angelou, who will put it ever so more eloquently than I ever could, in saying that we have to start by having difficult conversations and learn so we can know better. And when we know better, we can do better. I also know that you didn't log in here today to listen to me, so let me introduce our amazing panel of experts to help get the conversation started. Our first special guest today is Dr. Robert Q. Berry III, who's the Samuel Braley Gray Professor of Mathematics Education and the past president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, the world's largest math education. He's sponsored here today by Savvis Learning. Our next special guest is Dr. Tim Jacoby. He's the professor and chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning at Southern Methodist University. His research focuses on various issues related to statistics education and teacher preparation. He brings a unique aspect to this presentation today because of his work in educational testing services. Our next panelist is Dr. Eva Schweiner. She's the manager of K-12 Mathematics, Science, and STEM. Next is Mr. Brian Knowles, the manager of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. After that, we have Ms. Michelle Martin, School District of Palm Beach County Program Planner for Gifted Education. Our next panelist is Dr. Adam Miller, the School District of Palm Beach County Director of Educational Technology. Our next panelist is Mr. Harvey Oaxaca, Director of Multicultural Education and Migrant Education. And lastly, we have Dr. Diana Snyder, School District of Palm Beach County, Executive Manager in the Division of Teaching and Learning, and past President of the Florida Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And my name is Mickey Bannock. I'm the Elementary Math Program Planner here at the School District of Palm Beach County. So let's get started with our first questions. All right. So the first question we have is, with everything that's going on in our country right now, how is the current situation impacting your work? How are you addressing injustice, inequities within our organization, especially within classrooms? Let's begin with Dr. Berry to kick us off, please.
All right. Hi, welcome everyone. This is a big question. My role, I am the immediate past president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And there are a couple of things that we're doing organizationally, I think that benefits a wide variety of stakeholders. So one of the things last Monday, Trina Wilkerson and I put forward a statement that impacts what's currently happening nationally. So we put a statement forward talking about Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, and really stating that we teach more than mathematics. And in stating that we teach more than mathematics, honoring, the kind of perspectives on issues of social justice and social injustice, as well as equity and access issues. So that is one thing. And so we're trying to elevate that conversation beyond just, just focusing on classroom and schools, but also how do we support people to do the work on anti-racist and trauma-informed education? And what does it mean for someone to do that work? And I argue in order to do that work, it's not a set of lessons or activities that one do. It is, really doing the work. So it might mean engaging in reading that you normally may not read. It might mean watching and doing things that you normally may not do, but really trying to understand it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. And so, I quote the work of Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, in that. So that is one thing that we're doing. Another thing that we're doing with NCTM is we're working on a document called Moving Forward. And the idea of moving forward is thinking about what should schools, school districts, classrooms consider as they move into the next academic year, 2020 and 2021. And so in that conversation, we're having conversations around 3 issues that impact equity and access: structural considerations that schools and school districts should consider, teaching practices that schools and school districts should consider, and then advocacy. And so that document should be coming forward on the NCTM website a little bit later. And these are things as you begin to plan for next year, whether you're face-to-face, remotely, or distance, what are the considerations one should think about as they begin to engage in this work? So I'll stop right there and let my colleagues pick up after me.
Brian, you want to take a crack at this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Berry. Thank you, Mickey. Thank you all for this opportunity. So first of all, I'm going to say naturally, just the current situation has definitely created a lot of frustration and anger with me. So I'm trying to take that anger and channel it within my work. So as the manager of the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies for the School District of Palm Beach County, one of my many responsibilities is to make sure that we're developing culturally responsive curriculum in our classrooms. So this whole current situation has definitely made me more aggressive in my stance to make sure that our schools are teaching the history that represents our students. And I'm going to just kind of zone in specifically on Black students for this conversation. I can even go back to 1933 with Carter G. Woodson. Is the thought of inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies. And as the psychological impact of having our history absent in our classroom, and also our history being taught inaccurately in our classroom, is also have a psychological impact on our students, and also conversely on white students when they're also seeing their Black counterpart as inferior. Because the way that we teach and also what we teach in our classrooms. I did a radio show maybe last week, and one of the things that the radio host asked me is, where do we start as far as healing and having these conversations? And where do we start to kind of dismantle racism within attitudes, not within systems and structures? And one of the things that I mentioned and brought to the forefront is that, first of all, we need to identify the humanity of Black people and Black students, which are our culture, and within what we've done in mainstream American society is that we've not done that. So we have an opportunity right now to reimagine and reform education. And I've said this numerous times that we have an opportunity right now to create a new normal. we're in a rush to get back to what normal, whatever that reality looks like. For some of us, we have the opportunity to reimagine and recreate that. Normal and educational spaces are schools that underserve, underrepresent, and ultimately fail students of color. So we need to reimagine it and recreate that. So I'm really just trying to use my position to instead of protesting in the streets, which is good, but also use my position of power and my position within the educational system here locally, that we can impact and we can shift and create a new normal where a Black student doesn't have to feel inferior, and also their white counterpart doesn't have to see him that way. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Martin, Gifted Program Planner for Palm Beach County School District. And thank you, Mickey, so much for having me to be a part of this. One of the ways that this current situation is impacting the work that I do with gifted education is, for years, I've worked within this department, within this program, actually within just gifted education nationally, to fight against inequity, to fight against the lack of access for Black students and other students of color, because there is this underwritten mindset that Black students tend to perform lower as it relates to intelligence. So one of the major ways of addressing this injustice or this inequity within the organization is getting people to realize, to open their eyes to see that Black students are fully capable of performing at or above the levels of their peers, and showing them what it looks like to identify them adequately, finding resources and tools to make sure that that's happening, educating teachers to really open their eyes to see that there are students that are capable of learning at this advanced rate, and that many of them have been overlooked from the beginning, and that if we don't change the scope in which we view students, we'll never actually see that there's a potential for them to do that. So I model myself with the phrase or with the quote from Malala Yousafzai, who said, I raise up my voice not so I can shout, but so those without a voice can be heard. We cannot succeed when half of us are held back. So the way that this work is directly impacted is looking at ways that we can ensure that none of our students are being left behind or being forgotten with the abilities they have, especially when it comes to math. And we know that statistically, African-American students have the ability to perform, but they're not being given those opportunities. So this work drives me. The passion behind it truly drives me to make sure that we are identifying those inequities and that we're actually making a plan. So through teacher education, through programming, through working with people like Mickey, to make sure that we're using these opportunities to expand programming, not just in some schools or some areas, but to all areas, so that we have equitable access for those students.
Thank you, Michelle.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Diana Snyder, and Mickey, I want to thank you so much for including me on this panel. It is a fantastic group to be included with, so thank you. And Dr. Berry, as you are, I am the immediate past president of FCTM, the Florida Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and I highly recommend the role of past president. I'm sure you can appreciate that. So anyway, recently I have transitioned over to start working with K-12 literacy extensively, and we are getting ready to go into a new K-12 ELA textbook adoption. And to echo Brian Knowles' words, we have to plan to create a new normal, and we have to do better. So I'm really focused on embracing this current situation to make the normal different. We want the instructional materials that we have in front of our students to be truly reflective of our students. We must demand better of our publishers, and we must demand better of ourselves. So I am taking that passion and moving forward, and I'm going to be a very vocal force in this upcoming adoption. We want our instructional materials that we place in front of our students to not only reflect the racial makeup and the ethnic makeup of our students, but we want it to be inclusive of all students. I mean, when we say all, we really mean all. We want to walk the talk and make sure that everything that we provide to our students is truly reflective of our diversity. We're proud of our diversity in Palm Beach County, and we know we can do better. And to echo Mickey's comments at the beginning, when you know better, you do better.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Jacoby. Mickey, again, thanks for having me here too. Just to talk about in my role as department chair. So we are tackling things as a group and really starting to have some difficult conversations that have not been had in a long time. I really appreciated what Brian shared earlier, as well as what Robert shared about how to be an anti-racist. We are talking about having and organizing book groups to read Racing to Class by Milner and Start Where You Are But Don't Stay There by Milner and Billings. To have these conversations, especially as white faculty as well, to stop ignoring the problem and have active voice ourselves, and to see and to listen, so that way we become active participants in the discussion. Oftentimes, diversity committees that are formed at university or school districts and things consist mainly of faculty that are in the minority groups. And I think that it's time for that to change, and time for us to step up and help to give a voice that is certainly should be heard, and follow up with action and support in the best ways that we can. It's time to listen a lot clearer, and to stop, like Robert was saying, not to be just not racist, but anti-racist, and to be more aware of what that actually means. And I think the times today are allowing us to figure that out. What I'd encourage others to do is, especially administrators, is to organize similar book groups among all the faculty, so that way these conversations are had and no longer ignored.
Thank you, Tim.
Good afternoon. As everyone said, thank you for asking me to be here. Harvey with Multicultural and Migrant Education. So just in our role in general, what we really focus on is working to support all of our emergent bilinguals, our dual language, our world language students, our migrant students, our immigrant students throughout the district. And so part of what has really struck a chord with me in the last couple of weeks is really thinking about how do we as a team give voice to those who have a quieter voice. I don't think we can really say give a voice to the voiceless, because really everyone has a voice. And I think we're seeing that in really unique and powerful ways right now. But there are certain groups of people, because of variety of reasons, systemically or for any other reasons, that their voices have been quietened and they're not as loud. And so part of our work right now is really thinking about how do we bring those who have a voice, whether it's loud or quiet or somewhere in the middle, to the conversation. And so we've been having, as a team, lots of conversations, and we'll continue to have conversations about how do we get in the conversation, right? Because, injustice in one place, as MLK says, injustice in one area is a threat to justice everywhere. And so how do we stand and become allies with our work to make sure that we're giving voice to those who need it, who deserve it, and as Tim said, and really start listening, not just being at the table with the conversation, but really listening to what people are saying, so that we can create whatever the new normal will be, and hopefully a better situation as we move forward. So really being actively engaged in that conversation to give voice to those who might be quieter for whatever reason. So that's kind of the work that we're doing right now.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Miller, the Director of Educational Technology, and thank you, Mr. Bannock, for this great opportunity. So this current situation, our work in the Department of Education Technology really is focused, ensuring all students have equal opportunities through technology and training of teachers. Mr. Oaxaca mentioned, everyone has a voice. I think in our department, we definitely make sure we want to listen to all voices, and consider those different viewpoints. One way we do that is, encouraging honest and open conversations within our department and any of our trainings. Finally, just hopefully just helping. If someone needs something, whether it's technology or training or other pieces, it's our responsibility to help others, and that's what we do.
Thank you, Adam. So listening to the group, it sounds like it's our charge then to build a cultural responsive environment. So the next question I pose is, how can we build that culturally responsible environment, including our English language learners, our special ed students, our gifted students, et cetera, in the math classroom? How can we make this happen?
Hey, so my name is Eva Swiner. I'm the manager of K-12 Math, Science, and STEM, and I just wanted to just say how truly humbled I am to be in the company of such amazing people that are really talking about all of this and bringing all of this to light and to air so that we can kind of start reframing what this looks like for us in a classroom. So when we talk about a culturally responsive environment or teaching in that way in a classroom, it really goes to, in my opinion, a lot of the things that have already been mentioned, making sure that all students have a voice. You know, historically, we see classrooms where African-American language learning students, all these students that just never feel for whatever reason that they have agency or they have an identity in that classroom. And so creating a safe space where they do have an identity, where they have agency. This was something that Dr. Berry actually spoke about earlier this morning in the session that he did earlier, creating a space where everyone has a voice and has the opportunity to share their brilliance and their intelligence and their understanding. Especially in math, when we talk about how we attack a problem, there's not always one answer for the way we can kind of attack a problem, take it apart, and answer it. So letting those students, all students, have a voice and share their expertise may help someone else. And also thinking about how we bring the real world into our classrooms, not just in math, but in every single content area that we teach in. How do we bring real world experiences, what students see and engage in every day, what their world looks like, their voice, their culture? How do we embody this in the classrooms that we teach in the materials that we choose to put in front of them, in the resources and text that we use to teach and convey our message and our standards? All of that, I think, becomes a really essential component of what we do as a teacher and the culture that we create and the environment that we create in our classrooms.
Great, thank you.
So I think kind of along with what Eva's saying is, you know, really looking at students with what they are bringing, what's our asset-based lens, you know, and not looking at students from a deficit perspective. You know, all students do have a voice, and they, as Brian had said, we need to think of the humanity of our students, but really thinking about what are our students bringing to the table that we can use to build and to grow. And so thinking about, you know, mathematics particularly is taught taught differently all around the world, and thinking about how do we leverage those experiences within our own classroom. So not saying that was taught the wrong way or this was not the right way, but really this is how you learned it. Let's talk about what the differences are and appreciate those differences. One of the ways that, particularly for ELL students, we do that a lot is really thinking about language and utilizing students' home language, a native language in our experiences and in our teaching. So thinking about mathematics teachers as language teachers as well. And as we build vocabulary, not only looking at cognates and words that might go easily between different languages, but also how do you say this word in Arabic? How do you say this word where you come from? What might be a different way to approach this as a problem? So thinking about how we allow students to use what they have, their own culture, their native language is really, I think, really important for our ELL students, even in their responses, and working with those students to allow them to be comfortable in the math classroom, utilizing native language through an asset-based lens. I think that's one definite way that we can create that cultural responsive mathematics classroom.
And I can just chime in also. One of the things that we need to stop doing is calling, you know, learning or the mathematics racial or culturally neutral. I've been in many spaces when people think that, you know, fields such as science or mathematics is culturally neutral, is race neutral, which is not true. One of the things that Eva said is that bringing in real world experiences, we use word problems in mathematics, but we must identify when we say real world, that word is relative. Real world scenarios or experiences are going to be relative. My experiences or my realities is not going to be the same as Harvey's or Mickey's. Even Dr. Berry's or Michelle's. So all of our realities and all of our norms are going to be relative, and they're going to be different based on who we are. So we need to make sure that in our classrooms, in fields such as math, that first of all, there are a lot of ways that you can make it culturally responsive through word problems that create scenarios that shows a Black child or Black boy where I'm going to use this in life. Where is this going to be applicable? In addition to, you can even bring in a history of where people of African descent or people of African diaspora even contributed to that particular subject area.
Absolutely, Brian. You touched on a lot of what I was going to cover with this. One of the things I like to tell people when it comes to the groundwork of teaching culturally responsive or creating a culturally responsive environment is first, death to deficit learning, death to identifying students by their supposed inabilities, and let's start thinking about the way that the kids can learn and what they can do. As it relates to giftedness or the way that we utilize gifted learning, one of the major ways to do this and to get it going is by universal screening, seeing where students are, utilizing and determining what you know about that student as a nonverbal learner, as a pictorial analogist, as a student who identifies with tactile learning and all those things, and then applying that to the way that you're teaching that student. Culturally responsive means that you're going beyond just identifying how the student is identified by their race or their culture, but saying how does that role or how does their culture impact the way that they learn, or impact the way that they interpret knowledge, or impact the way that they're going to utilize this in the future, taking that identification for each student. And when I tell teachers that, they get overwhelmed, but truly for each student, and then developing a plan of action for educating those students that really incorporates everybody's culture. Not as a one culture identification, but truly as how does this impact and what does it look like when you do cross-culturally? How have these impacts been different, even in the way that we utilize math, even in the way that this plays into economics, even in the way that we look at demographics of things, or how all of these different factors have mattered with these individual demographics, the individual cultures. Looking at ways for providing opportunities for students to participate in gifted learning at their own site is a huge way to build culturally responsive environment, because it does not take the student from their learning in their comfort zone around their peers and place them in a foreign place, but it gives them an opportunity to learn around their teachers or learn with people that they're the most comfortable with in a way that expands their knowledge. So truly educating our educators in a way that they can truly be able to extend that learning within their school site before we ship them off is going to build that culturally responsive classroom in math, and then giving more training to our teachers to allow them to be able to truly maximize on each opportunity to know that these kids have it within them and they're able to do it. How can you identify it through a non-deficit thinking model to truly incorporate the learning activities to make sure it's positive? So that's one of the major things that when I think about culturally responsive environments, especially in the math classroom, is by creating a culture that lets students know that, one, we use math with anything. Math is everywhere. It's all around us. So I knew the way to get to my students was food. Everything was attached to food. I like to eat. So I found a way to incorporate food in science, in ELA, in math. In every single subject, we incorporated food. And guess what? My kids got more engaged. But then I always brought it back to, how does this affect us culturally? How does it affect the way that we interpret things? And when we think about those things in a more intentional way, we can actually impact our students a lot more thoroughly.
Wow, that was a lot to go after. See if I can honor that space. Thank you so much. So there are a couple of things I want to bring to the conversation. And I had a thought, then my thought got kind of shifted. So one thing I want to bring to the conversation, the study of ethnomathematics. If you're not familiar with the study of ethnomathematics, I'm going to invite you to take a look at this. There was a book that came out in the year 2000, and as Mr. Knowles was talking, I could not remember the title of the book, but it has the word ethnomathematics in it. It's challenging Eurocentric views of mathematics. We know, I always tell my students at University of Virginia, we invented this. When I say we, I'm referring to myself and from whom I come from. And so this idea of the study of mathematics. But I want to bring the conversation back to culturally responsive teaching and Geneva Gay's theoretical framework, because I think that's important, because she laid out 5 ideas in her theoretical framework. And if I can just kind of, I'm going to be short with this. The first one is cultural responsive teaching validates children's cultural heritage to build bridges of meaningfulness between home and school experiences. And that's important because sometimes for many kids, the school is a foreign place for them. And when you say, what I mean by that, it is not connected to the kinds of resources that they bring to the school experience. And when you don't honor or acknowledge the resources, and I'm saying resources because kids come to school with resources, and too often their resources are neglected. And so we have to honor those resources that they bring to them, bring to school. The second thing that Dr. Gay brings up is culturally responsive teachers develop intellectual, social, emotional, and political comprehensive learning opportunities. Political comprehensive learning opportunity. And too often we stay away from the idea of looking at the socio-political implications of schools and schooling. And we know that school itself is political, it's a politicized space. And I don't want to get into the whole politics of it, but it is whose history is privilege and whose history is not privilege. Whose experiences are privileged, whose experiences are not privileged. And so that is the politicized nature that I want to kind of unpack. The third thing she talked about is multidimensional. And that when we say multidimensional, we're talking about the kinds of relationship. Too often we think about the student-teacher relationship when we think about teaching practices, but there's also the student relationship that we have to give some thought to as well. And this is where the kind of the cross-cultural, the cross-resource connection that students can make to one another that I think sometimes we don't take full advantage of, because kids can learn a lot from each other. Too often authority lies with the teacher and the curriculum, and the authority has to be shifted to children themselves. And if we can share authority in the classroom, that means that kids can author ideas in mathematics. Kids can author ideas across a lot of subject areas, but too often authority lies with the adult in the room. And I hope we can disrupt that. The other thing is self-determination. She talked about self-determination and empowerment. And this idea of self-determination and empowerment really sits at this. So I often ask people, do you believe in the brilliance of children? And if they often say yes, so can you tell me one thing or practice that you do in your classroom that shows that you believe in the brilliance of children? Now, do you believe in the brilliance of Black children? What is that one thing that you do in your classroom that serves as evidence that you believe in the brilliance? And those are hard questions to answer. You know, and it's okay not to have an answer to that question. My point is that now I want you to think about what is it that you're doing to show that you believe in the brilliance of children. And the fifth thing she mentioned is too often that is overlooked is emancipatory and liberating. What are we doing in classrooms that kids can be liberated from their current context socially, politically, and otherwise, that they feel this idea that they're developing this idea of social consciousness, critical consciousness, political consciousness in their schools and in their classroom. And that happens in mathematics. I think we're in the current context where we can do that mathematically. I mean, there's a lot of math around us. And, you know, when we say that, I often say we're bombarded with data, and we have to question the data that is bombarded with us daily in our newspapers and in our media spaces, and not to dismiss them, but question it. Just question it and see the plausibility of those things. So I'll stop there because I feel like I'm on a soapbox. So I'll stop right there.
This is all of our soapbox, Dr. Berry. So on March 13th, we had to move very quickly to distance learning. And I feel like our Palm Beach team moved heaven and earth in order to make distance learning happen with the rollout of a continuity website, with the learning and very quick training of instructional materials and deployment of devices. So how can we support all families with distance learning, through the lens of equity?
So I'll start. In the ed tech field, we have a saying called digital divide. When we consider equity in ed tech, we always consider the digital divide. And it's usually made up of two pieces, but since we done our district in March and the onset of distance learning, kind of come to realize there's more aspects to it. And I'd like to go through those 5 really quickly, if that's okay, to the panel. The 5 are, we need to consider devices, we need to consider internet access, we need to consider tech support, we need to consider training for families, and we need to consider training for teachers. So I'll just go into each one. So devices, a student can't have an equitable learning experience at home if they don't have a device that supports that. That's the first piece. We have to make sure they have them. The second is internet access. A device is well and good, but if the student doesn't have good enough broadband internet access at home to other students, their experience in a live Google Meet or any kind of live experience is going to be hindered, and they're going to learn a lot less. Tech support is the third piece. Everyone needs tech support. Let's be honest. So that's a need, and we need to make sure that's available for all families. And teachers need to consider that too. Just because you send an assignment out doesn't mean the students could be able to complete it. So let's talk about the last 2 for training support for families. So when we went to distance learning, a lot of parents started to become teachers, right? They had to help their students with, I'll be honest, I know this is a math discussion. I was great with my daughters, helping them all the way up to elementary math. After that, I couldn't do it. However, but training for families on the technology side is hugely important. If the parents are able to help their children troubleshoot some basic issues or know what to expect and the format of how instruction is going to come to them, then those parents are better able to help their students. But that goes with the 5th piece, and that's really training for our teachers. So when teachers are in the classroom, they can control the learning environment. When students are at home, however, the learning environment can be very different. All the ideas are brought up in question 2 about culturally responsive teaching is very necessary here for teachers. And I would say doubly so because now the students are at home. Also within that, I would also add that there's, students are going to have very, very different home lives. Whether it's culture, whether it's socioeconomic status, whether it's other things. Teachers need to be well trained and need to be cognizant of their students' home lives so they can plan well. If not, then there's no way they can reach equity in their teaching from distance learning because they're just not considering it in their planning. So I would highly suggest for all the teachers listening, think about those 5 areas as you're planning and if we have to continue distance learning in the future. Thank you.
I would say too, really thinking about recognizing that the word family is not a monolith, right? So all of our families and all of our groups are very diverse. And so really considering, kind of going back to that voice, making sure that we're asking the families, what is it you need from us? How can we help support you in this environment? Because I think all too often we do things without always getting the voice of every or as many people as possible. We tend to listen to the loudest voices. So really thinking about, to support families, we have to have their voice at the table. We have to know what they need. We have to know that they may not need anything, right? Like it doesn't necessarily mean that they need something. But then the other thing too is, we work in my team a lot on translations and making sure that we've translated as many documents as possible to into whatever other languages that we possibly can. But I think it's also important to recognize and to remember that many families come from an oral tradition. And so we have to find ways to provide oral videos or oral instructions as well, just as another piece to help bring in as many families as possible. So really providing, whether it's instructions or just support or whatever it looks like, in as many different versions as possible, right? When we, sometimes we send out big, long letters of information or emails that are just full of words. And so really thinking about how do we break that up? How do we add in some pictures or some videos or things that will help families who are, moving really quickly or dealing with lots of other things, to help break that up for them so that they can have what they need to do the things they need to do in their families. So really thinking about how we present information to families, and also making sure that we're hearing their voices. And by I mean every family within all the groups that we represent and all the student groups within our whole district. So not just one or two, but really every different group, and how do we present that information in a variety of ways for them.
Harvey, to really piggyback on what you're saying, yes, I 100% agree. Like, I couldn't have said it better myself. Like, you literally stole the words right out of my mouth of what I was planning on saying, but really also to just be mindful kind of about what Adam was saying. Also be mindful that students' experiences are different. I'm fortunate I get to stay at home with my kids and teach them while I'm working. There are other families that don't have that. You have students and siblings that are taking care and teaching when their parents are at work. So just being patient, being kind, being thoughtful about, what gets sent home, like you said, and just really understanding that not everyone's experience is the same as your own, and that some students might need additional supports and others might. So really just being thoughtful about it, and to also echo on what Michelle said earlier, get to know your kids. Right? I mean, you can't know what they need if you don't know them. You can't know how to connect with them and how to teach to them or have them understand if you don't know them as a person. So if I don't know my students, I would never be able to realize what kind of conversation I need to have with them when it comes to how I engage them in learning the math, or how I connect with them on telling a story, or what types of text they learn from if I don't know them as a person. And like Michelle said, it's a big task, but it's necessary now more than ever that we do what we can to get to know personally every single one of those kids in our classrooms and bring families into the fold. I mean, there's no better way to understand what a family's life is like than to hear from them. Let them bring their experiences into their classrooms. Let them bring their culture into their classrooms to tell the stories, to create the word problems that they use, to engage in the text. Let them be the voice in our classrooms, the family as a whole.
Wow. So yeah, I would add to that. I mean, all of that is great. I think one of the things, I think there's a level of sensitivity that we have to have as well. I mean, because right now we're in this space, particularly, whether there's a Zoom meeting or what we're doing now. If we really think about, we are letting people into our homes. I'm at home right now, and you guys, while you can't see my entire home, I stage it in such a way that you can't see it. Let's think about that from a student parental perspective and what that might mean. And so this might mean that some kids don't turn on their cameras for whatever reasons. And it might mean that some kids want to share more of who they are. But nonetheless, we are in their homes, maybe not physically, but we're in there some type of way, and honoring and thinking about what that might mean. And there might be reasons socially, culturally, or what have you, why one invites or not invite people into their home. I think what this period also brings to us is the idea of additional support. While we can talk about hardware and software supports that family needs, it also talks about the distance between what is taught in schools and what parents have learned when they were learners. And that distance in many cases, particularly in math, can be pretty glaring. And so what are the supports that we can provide for parents to help them understand, well, when you were at school, you may have learned it this way. Well, now we do it a little bit differently. And and it's not a politicized discussion. It means that we've learned a lot through research since you were in school, that we now can do this better than when you were in school. And so helping parents understand that. So you know, one of the things I've been able to do is, you know, I found, you know, so one, I guess YouTube, series I would recommend, Math in the World. He is, and this is, what is Matt's last name? Oh gosh. So you just have to look it up. But what he's done, he's created a series of videos. So what's wrong with carrying the one? Parents ask that question in math. You know, why carry the one when I was in school? Why can't we carry the one? Or what's wrong with invert and multiply? I mean, those are questions that parents would ask. And having some resources for parents to understand what we have learned through research since they were in school about algorithms, about learning, and about problem solving could be quite helpful in making those conversations about mathematics accessible to them. And not to imply what you learned when you were at school was wrong. It means that we've learned a lot.
Thank you all very much for that one. So now that we'd have a charge of building a culturally responsive environment, where can we get resources to teach these kinds of culturally responsive lessons? Or where can we find activities or resources for elementary students?
Wow. I'll let you go first, Mr. Knowles.
I was going to let you go first, bro. But I'm going to take a stab at this. I'm definitely not a mathematician, right? I've never taught math. I think the highest grade I ever got in the math class is maybe a B, and that was just off of the grace of that teacher. But in my mind, the way I kind of view it is, like, first of all, who's developing curriculum at our district level? So building capacity is one of the ways, because it's hard to find resources, because you got to think that we're just historically marginalized people. So there's not a whole lot of curriculum that's going to reflect and really even capture our experiences the right way, in the right light. So it's about building capacity to me, and just based on even some of the experiences that I've had here in Palm Beach with team members and people who are writing the curriculum, that you can build capacity around understanding the experiences, and also hiring people. That could be a whole HR thing, that look like our student demographic, that have lived those experiences, that can kind of relate to realities of the students that we serve here. That you can create and develop math questions and word problems and develop curriculum that is culturally responsive. I know here in Palm Beach that we have team members that are always coming to us with questions that they're creating, that are integrating African and African American experience and cultural experiences within math problems. And we just kind of work together to kind of vet each other's work, to kind of build and help each other and support each other to that extent. So that's my best answer. You get what I'm saying? So we can build capacity with our curriculum developers to be able to identify, to create that curriculum, because in these spaces, you know, even on my end in social studies and within history, that a lot of times I can't go out easily and grab curriculum or find just like some kind of storehouse where I can adequately address the things that I'm trying to express in a curriculum. So it comes from just the ingenuity and creativity that I have innately within, and also working with other like-minded people that we can build off each other and create.
Wow. Thank you for that. So I want to go back to kind of the beginning of our conversation, because one of the things I think we have to be mindful about is that we have to have people who want to do this work, who want to be culturally responsive, who want to engage in social justice. Even if we had the activities, and to give activities to someone who don't want to do the work, it can be dangerous and actually could be damaging. I'd rather you not do it than to do it horribly. So just to have the resources available is one thing, but also to have the resources available for people who are responsive and responsible and who are willing to do this work is something quite differently. So, you know, just finding resources, if you can find them, it's just great. But I think what we can do is create frameworks for people who do this work to begin to invest in ways that they can create their own type of lessons and their own type of activities because they've invested in the work of doing this. And so it's not a matter of having a math objective, but you can have a social justice objective. And how does that social justice objective intersect with the math objective? Because we talk about practices and processes in mathematics, they're not foreign to social justice work. And so, it requires that the people who want to teach this way do the work, do the reading, listen to documentaries, whatever it is they need to do to become better informed, to become anti-racist and trauma informed, whatever they need to do that. So I'm going to suggest 4 things. One, thinking about equitable mathematics teaching practices. And those are things that we've talked about with NCTM. We identify 8 practices. We intersect that with identity, agency, positionality, and authority. 2, invest in time in authentic, challenging, social and mathematical questions and concerns. So there are all kinds of things out there right now in our current context, whether it's around COVID, whether it's around, it depends on how political one wants to be, police brutality and the numbers and the statistics around that, whether it's around housing and redlining, all of those issues are there. And then where's the mathematics in that? I think they illuminate themselves once you begin to unpack the issues. And then, having a social and a mathematical understanding. So, all of us had a brilliant math teacher. Let me say this. All of us have had when I was in undergrad, I've had brilliant math people who taught me, but were not brilliant teachers. All right. They knew their math, but they could not communicate it in such a way that made it accessible to me. But so then but having a social and mathematical understanding that intersects with that is more than that. It is a person who's investing in the work. And the 4th thing, that if you're going to teach culturally relevant or find culturally relevant activity, what is it in the activity that's going to require for someone to now invest in some type of project, practice, or policy? So you just don't teach the lesson. What happens after the lesson is done? It takes an activist stance. And if you're not willing to do that part, then don't do that part. Don't do any of it. I mean, being culturally responsive and culturally relevant requires activism. And so you got to invest in the activism part of it. Just teaching a lesson is just not enough. You have to go beyond just teaching the lesson. I'm sorry.
Dr. Berry, I'm smiling so big because you literally brought together exactly what I was going to say. I'm always very cautious when we put out the call to finding resources or finding lessons and activities around culturally relevant material or culturally relevant things for elementary students or any student, to be honest. My biggest concern with that is that it's as if you're looking for a one-size-fits-all type solution to a problem that's so diverse and so different in every way that you see it. So when I think about the best way to find those types of things with culturally relevant math lessons, activities, and resources, they have to be built from the ground up. So you have to train people to be able to develop those tools within the classrooms. That's why we in our gifted education really focus a lot on making sure that we're doing problem-based and inquiry-based and project-based learning, because the learning does have to do something once you're done with it. That's what makes it relevant to the culture, is that once you learn about these things, once you implement them, they have action that follows. So I couldn't do anything but smile huge when you said that, because it is the service learning that comes with identifying a problem, analyzing it through a mathematical lens, and then formulating some type of tool or something to make it move forward for change. Our goal is to create little change agents, not just to have kids that can solve 3 + 2 is 5. We need them to be able to do more than that. So thank you for wrapping that up, because that's a perfect segue into how we can make that happen.
And just one more point, just kind of just echoing off both Michelle and Dr. Berry. Yeah, it's extremely important, just really back to the point of capacity building, how to develop that content and also how to deliver that content. So I can create the greatest lesson, have the dopest resources, but I can still go to the classroom and make it terrible or just make it extremely whack based on if I don't have the right approach to it. And it's real important, and Dr. Barrett, what you were saying about social action approach. You know, we want to inspire, we want to engage and empower our students to be into social activism. You want to make them socially conscious that they can be change makers within a community, and that's predicated on Dr. James Banks' work. We talk about the levels of multicultural reform or levels of multicultural integration, you know, that we need to go beyond what we call representation. We need to go beyond just the basic levels, but we need to make our curriculum more transformative and also social action approach. Take that approach that we're inspiring our kids to be change agents. Culturally relevant is not taking a problem instead of, you know, that Johnny had 2 apples and how many did Johnny take 3 away from Kate or whatever. And I know that's just how bad my math is. I'm all over the place. But replacing those names, we're going to say Malik and Keisha, and now we're culturally responsive to Black students. But we're talking about completely changing the conceptual framework of that to a transformative level that's applicable to Keisha and Malik's life. But also, how can we, in our teaching, inspire these students to be those change makers?
So I think this is a really great segue then to our next question on, and Brian just alluded to this, you know, some pieces that are missing from our curriculum, but what are some other things that we can identify that are missing from the curriculum or school operations to help build more equitable practices?
I can go ahead and start. Just wanted to comment on a lot of what's been said today, and just want to echo what Robert's been saying in regard to anti-racism. Almost 80% of teachers are white. And so I think one of the most important things, if we're going to see what's missing, is to actually acknowledge and become aware of the privilege that we're living with. And I think now is the time to start paying particular attention to it. Another thing that resonated with me and is in my particular area of passion is information and statistical literacy, and to really start looking at what information is being presented in the media as well as in other groups and in schools, so that way we can inform our society in terms of how to know when things might be occurring that might be misleading them, in a way to make people more aware of how to question the information that they're receiving and where it's coming from, and to make that as culturally relevant as possible as well. And so there's been a big push for more and more statistics and quantitative literacy in the classroom, and I think that push is going to continue, and I think it needs to. Oftentimes people will say you can say anything you want to say with statistics, but the truth is that you can say anything you want to say about with statistics to people who don't understand statistics. And so we need to change that, so that way people know how to question the data they're being presented with. And that includes teachers in terms of the way assessments are created and the way assessments are evaluated and the information that's given to marginalize different groups and potentially paint people in a corner, rather than celebrating the success that the school districts have, teachers have, and all of our students have. And so from my perspective, I think those are the biggest things missing, is the awareness of privilege, and a focus on really informational literacy and trying to see through statistics. And I think a lot of work can be done in that area.
Adding to that, our district, Palm Beach County, over the last decade has been very intentional about increasing access to accelerated coursework and building those equitable practices. And we've been very explicit about PD for teachers to remove gatekeeping. And you know, we have so many teachers that do that, and we've been intentional about those PD practices to make sure that has been removed. We have created opportunities for curriculum compacting. Mickey mentioned this at the beginning with the accelerated math program that we've done, but we've been very intentional about providing access for all students to these accelerated coursework. We've provided training to our administrators. We've had actual PD on master board training for all of our schools, but especially our secondary schools. And this has been going on for the last decade. And when our teams look at the data, we are rather than patting ourselves on the back, we are more concerned about the massive gaps that we see. So we've been commended by other districts, we've been commended by other organizations, and yet we are ashamed at the gaps that we continue to see. So we definitely have an intentional ongoing focus. So these equitable practices are something that continues to grow, and it's a lifelong pursuit to get there. I don't think we ever really will be there.
So I want to tie in on the last part of that question in terms of school operations and building equitable practices. And I appreciate Tim's bringing up the idea that 80% of our teachers are white. But I think there are opportunities too often that school districts might miss. There's more diversity in our paraprofessionals. And when you look at the diversity that exists, and I'm not saying that those numbers are overwhelmingly diverse, but there's more diversity, let's say, in that space. And so what does that mean? These people are, and I don't like to use the term paraprofessional, but I'm gonna use it for the sake of this conversation. But these are access to people and human resources that come in contact with students every day. How do we then empower them if they choose to take a pathway that might lead to working with students in more significant ways? Are there pathways for them to become teachers if they care to become teachers? Are there pathways to work with students in more significant ways? I think the diversity that sits there is the opportunity that we too often don't see when it's right there in front of our faces. And they're often, that diversity also recognizes that they are the community agents. They too often live in the community from which our students come from. And how do we then acknowledge the resources that group brings? And so too often school operations and human resources miss that part as a way of elevating people in those spaces to be more significant in the education of our children.
Thank you for that. Out of deference to time, the next few questions I'm going to call the lightning round here, because I'd like to get to some more questions for one thing. And I'm going to start with, what are you reading right now? I think it's really important to continually grow as professionals. One of the books that I'm reading right now is We Got This by Cornelius Minor, because I recognize that I have some work to do around this subject as well. So what are you reading?
Great question, Mickey. Try to be lightning fast in the answer. So I'm rereading a book called Choice Words, How Our Language Affects Children's Learning. It's by Peter H. Johnston. It's not explicitly about racism. It's about the words that teachers use when they teach students and how it affects students. I think it's a good read for all teachers. Thank you.
I can go next. So I just finished Cultivating Genius by Golden Muhammad, who really just talks about equity framework and culturally and historically responsive literacy and what we put in front of students as far as text. The next one, who I'm waiting on Amazon because it's, of course, delayed, months at this point, but it's actually Dr. Berry's recommendation, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi.
I will go next. I am reading this Digital Leadership. It is The Changing Paradigms for Changing Times. How's that for appropriate right now? And that is my work read, but I'm the parent of two almost high school kids, 14-year-olds, and they have to read Painted House by John Grisham in order to get ready for 9th grade. So that's my evening read with the family, but Digital Leadership by Eric Scheninger.
Just because I enjoy being the oddball out, I'm actually not reading anything that I would like to share at this point. What I am doing is journaling faithfully. I feel the importance that when we think about literacy, it's not just reading, it's also writing. And so I'm doing more journaling than reading right now, and organizing in my thoughts and unpacking my feelings. And I suggest that everybody take a time to kind of journal this time in history where we are. I have my kids doing the same, because this is really important that we kind of honor where we are in this space and how it's affecting us mentally. And that we move in a place that we can acknowledge that, so that as we're developing and looking for more things to read and unpack, we can identify those things that'll be most helpful for us at this time.
So Michelle, I love that idea about journaling. For me, I'm reading actually two different books, The Anatomy of Peace, really what's at the heart of conflict, and then Refugee. It's about three young people who are refugees in three different time periods. And so understanding that we all have a common experience, but the experience is very different and it impacts us differently. So I'm excited about learning just from a different point of view as we move forward with the work.
And I'm reading The Last Pass, which is about Bob Cousy and Bill Russell's relationship, who were both Boston Celtics players, originally from Boston, and a huge sports fan. And it's really, obviously, they've talked a lot about sports over the years, but The Last Pass is Bob Cousy's, it's focused on Bob Cousy's reflection as he's 90 years old, and his biggest regret is not standing up for the social injustice that he observed Bill Russell experience as he was an NBA player back in the 60s.
Wow. So I'll follow on that. I am reading a children's book, actually, because I am in Charlottesville. We have Charlottesville Freedom Schools. If you're familiar with the Freedom Schools, Google it. But I'm reading "Salt in My Shoes" by Dolores Jordan. Dolores Jordan is Michael Jordan's mother, and so I'll be reading that to a group of first graders. And so I've been practicing on how to read that book to a group of first graders. So "Salt in My Shoes" is the book I'm reading right now.
And I'm going to hop in. I've been working from home, so immersed in my work, and working from home is just like you don't know when to cut it off. So I haven't had an opportunity to really read, but I'm listening to Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Dr. Kendi.
Thank you all very much for that one. So there's a lot going on, and I've been glued to the media in seeing the events unfold over the last several days now. And a question that I have for the panel here is, how and what are you sharing with your own children about the protests that are happening about police brutality and so forth?
So I guess I have multiple answers to that, because I have multiple children and they're all at different developmental ages and stages. So obviously it's a little bit different for my 6-year-old than it is with my 18-year-old. But with my 6-year-old, it's really kind of focused around, if you see something, say something. If you see someone that is being cruel or being mean, stand up for that person, because they may not have the strength to be able to stand up for themselves. With my 18-year-old, we talk a lot about privilege, our privilege, other people's privilege, and what that looks like. I mentioned earlier, I am privileged in that I get to stay home. My husband has to go to work. He works in the medical field. But we're privileged that we both have jobs. We're privileged that if he comes down with it, or if it's transmitted to us in some other way, shape, or form, we have healthcare. We also talk about it in terms of other family members. I am first generation. The rest of my family is from Cuba, and we still have family there. So we talk about how our privilege is different here than theirs there, and what we can do to help out not only our family there, but people who need help here. So if that means, going and just being an ear that someone needs to cry on, or a shoulder that someone needs to cry on, being an ear for someone who wants to talk and we need to listen, being available to engage in discussions and do something with that. We talk about listening and that being a huge part of listening to other people's perspectives, but then what do we do when we hear this? How do we stand up for what we honestly don't believe is true or correct or just? So it's a lot of conversations, it really is, and about how that can turn into action.
Thank you.
And to work off of exactly what Eva said, with our kids, we've got 14-year-olds. And so we've had lots and lots of conversations with them. But just as Eva said, it's about listening. We tell our boys that, God gave you 2 ears for a reason. It is important to listen to others. And we've worked hard to instill a level of empathy in our children so that way they can really hear. And although we won't be able to fully relate to others, listening and just keeping our mouths closed and listening to what others feel, and then being ready to stand next to them and stand up and support them. So we have had extensive conversations. We have watched the news. We've had conversations. We've looked around town as we've been driving in the car and seeing demonstrations and the support that we want these people to feel. So it has been a very intentional, overt conversation in our household.
Thank you.
So I don't have children of my own, but in my neighborhood, everyone knows that I work in education. And so it's been really interesting because friends and neighbors have reached out and said, what do we do? How do we have this conversation? And I think that the thing that I keep coming back to is really just being honest. Like, we have to be honest with our children, appropriately honest for a 5-year-old versus an 18-year-old, but understanding that we can't cover up or be polite about the situation, and this, we're trying to be kind to all people type situation. We really have to be honest and let our children know this is what's actually happening, and this is how we can work together to move to a different place. And I think, as Eva said, it's not just about having the conversation, because that's critical, but also, what do we do with that? How do we move from a place of just having an honest conversation about what's actually happening, but then also, what do we do? Can we and how do we encourage our young people to write letters, call, do those different types of ways of being in that space? But I think for me, that's been my suggestion to our neighbors is don't let politeness or kindness, or we don't have the opportunity to not do this. We must have this conversation, and I think that's kind of the idea that I've been trying to help my family and my friends with, is just be honest about what's going on.
Coming from a completely different perspective, as a Black woman, as a mother of 4 Black little girls, having to almost strip their innocence to talk to them about the things that are currently going on in the world has been really disheartening, because it's one of those things that I learned as a child growing up in Mississippi. And I was very informed with my parents and my mom being on the front of the civil rights movement. It's one of those things where you hope at some point you don't have to continue to have this conversation. I didn't think a generation later that I would still have to have this conversation with my daughters, but what I am doing is empowering them. I am educating them about themselves. I am letting them know that they are someone in this world who deserves to have a voice and has a voice. I'm teaching them how to safely self-advocate. A lot of times they've asked about the different protests and things that they've seen on the news. So I share with them the power in using your voice, the power in advocacy, the power in sharing your knowledge, the power in just being a person who doesn't mind speaking up for themselves. But that they're always constantly aware of the repercussions that come with that. Sometimes people are going to misjudge them based on what they believe them not to know. And so that's a hard thing to have to teach them. And I've taught them from a very early age. But if nothing else, I want to make sure that they're empowered and that they know that every person that they encounter won't mistreat them. So when you encounter people, give them the benefit of the doubt, but also give yourself an upper hand by knowing who you are and affirming who you are at all times. So it's a hard conversation, and I recognize the conversation is very different. I'm also teaching them the importance of living in this moment and valuing it, because we are in a very historic time right now. And to know that I believe truly that there is some change on the horizon is very, very powerful. And I want them to kind of relish in that they are a part of something that could potentially be extremely magical if we all work together to try to make some systemic change. So I share that with them, and we talk about it on a daily basis. And I know sometimes they get tired of it, but at 12, 9, 8, and even 3 years old, I need them to be aware. I need them to be alert, and I need them to be on guard to what this world could potentially offer them, and then what the world may at some point try to take away from them, which is their life, which I don't want. So I want them to know what's happening. So it's powerful in our house. The conversations can begin to get very heavy.
Thank you.
And definitely, you know, one of the things my sister Michelle just said is, you know, historical. So one of the things I'm constantly reminding my daughter of is that you're watching history, that you're watching a catalyst moment similar to what happened to Emmett Till in the 1950s. That this is a catalyst moment that can propel change and create real change. I'm also a big person that's big on narratives and how things are told and how things are presented. So I'm always reminding her. My daughter's, you know, at that age where she's always walking around with a phone. I kick myself even buying her a phone at this point because she's always in it. So therefore, those influences are there. So when the media portrays what's going on, I want her to understand that you're looking at something that's bigger than individual police officers and attitudes. That the people that you see in the streets, you know, because the media is going to focus in on the so-called looting, so-called rioters, what I like to call uprisers in our streets. And we're focusing on what's happening. But we have to, and I constantly remind her to focus on the larger issue at hand, is that you're looking at symptoms of a larger sickness known as racism. And racism is something that's bigger than individual attitudes. So how I feel about you because you're white, or how you feel about me because I'm black. But we're looking at systems as if something structural, it's something that's very deliberate, and it's something that's systemic. So I'm constantly just trying to make sure that I can kind of drive that home and drive the perspective and narrative to my daughter.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. So I guess I'll give a little bit of context. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I hope that you may have heard of what happened here in Charlottesville in August of 2017. And so with that context, and my children are older. I have a 23, 22, and 18-year-old. And so just this morning with my oldest son, you know, I asked, we talked, what was your first encounter with the police? And he revealed to me something I did not know. And so we have these conversations about being a Black man in this world and what it might mean, and how people weaponize, you know, go back to the incident that happened in Central Park, and how race is weaponized, and what that might mean and impact, you know, his life. But just, we really have you know, our conversations have really been around surviving in this world and what it means to be a Black man in this space, what it means to be in Charlottesville, Virginia, or in Virginia, period. And we're at a moment now where many of the legacies of the Confederacy are coming down, hopefully. And when what that means and the impact of that. And one thing I always say to them, racism is so endemic that it's normal. You know, in our city, we can walk by a monument and it's a Confederate monument, but you know, it's normalized. and then when you bring up the history behind it and all those other things, I mean, even there's a marker in Charlottesville that says slaves were sold here, and people walk by it every day. And this normalization is so problematic. And we have conversations about just the things we see living in a Southern community that is impacted by relics of a time that hopefully will go away and that it no longer exists.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to start. I can't imagine what Robert and Brian and Michelle feel in terms of having to have these conversations about how to avoid these difficulties when you encounter the police, or becoming aware of these stories that they were not aware of before this time, and what that must have been like, or what it must feel like to drive down the street with that fear. And so that's what I try to talk to my kids about, who are now almost 14 and 17. And it's amazing to think about that too, because Robert's kids and mine were super young when we were engaging in other practices. And so for them to be this age and to have the chance to talk to them about being willing to engage in difficult thought and discussion and stop ignoring it, to be aware of what my kids in particular take for granted, to tell the stories of what other families have to go through, as well as what conversations they must have to prepare their kids to engage with encounters, especially with the police. The fear that they don't have to live. And I want them to listen and develop perspective of what members of Black communities truly experience. And that also to become aware that hopefully change is possible. Like Michelle and Brian were talking about, this does feel different. Enough is enough. And I'm hoping that there is enough of a rising, and my kids and I talk about that, because hope can't lead to change unless we actually continue to engage and listen and actually do something about it. But it's absolutely well past time. And I agree with Brian that I think this is a pivotal moment, and I am truly hopeful that change will occur, but we have to continue to engage. And I want my kids to talk to their fellow students about it too. So that way this momentum does continue to hopefully one day, it's not, I'm sure, in the near future, but I don't want those conversations to always have to occur, or the fear to occur. It's time to stop. And so I want my kids to be aware of it. And that's the type of things we're talking about.
The momentum is building. It feels like it's a freight train picking up speed. With that being said, let's have our last question. So now that our teachers are heading off into the summer, and there's going to be some time now for them to think and to begin implementing in the fall, what are some words of inspiration that you have for all teachers and administrators at this time?
These are not actually my words of inspiration, but it has definitely inspired me. So I'm hoping that this will inspire others. But I've been inspired by the youth that are speaking up. They're demanding change. They are, going back to what Brian said, they are requiring a new normal. Michelle said the change is on the horizon, and that's what is inspiring to me. We have the honor to be part of this intentional systemic change, and it is just totally inspiring to me, is watching and hearing their words.
Thank you.
These are also not my words. I don't remember who said that, but someone said everything done well was done together. We've done, if we can do this, and we can do this together. Thanks.
When planning for instruction, don't plan so thoroughly that you forget to leave room for student input, for cultural experiences, and for time to process the affect of it all. Remember the whole child. Our children have experienced some very different times in the last couple of months. So as they're going about their planning and thinking about what's going to happen in the fall, keep that at the forefront of your mind, our kids' mental health.
Thank you.
And I would say, similar to Michelle, really recognize who our students are, and don't forget that they are coming with all kinds of great assets. They have a wealth of knowledge, and they have lived some experiences that I have not experienced at their age. And so really using that as a catalyst, but then to also remember that we have the opportunity to recreate the system. Don't have to keep it the same way. We're going through a huge change, and I think we cannot let that go. And so I would encourage us to really think about our own practices as we recreate this educational system as we move forward, to make sure that we have equity and justice really for everyone within our system, because the system is working. So let's recreate it so it will work.
And I just will say, lead by example. Teachers are leaders. Stop ignoring the privilege I mentioned before, 80% are white. We need to realize this and not let the momentum stop. And if you see it fading away, keep the conversation going, push the issue. I am having, for the first time in my career, first time in my life, real, true conversations about race, inequity, social justice. It's been happening for a long time, but I'm engaging with Black colleagues in ways that I never thought possible before, and having true, honest dialogue. And it's wonderful to have these conversations, because it gives a totally different awareness than whatever I was exposed to before. And I think as leaders, just don't be afraid. As teachers, don't be afraid. Engage with your kids, engage with your students, engage with your colleagues, and push your administrators to do things to have real change occur. And if we talk about taking culturally relevant and doing action with it, then let's actually go and do something about it. And hopefully that change will occur. And these lives that have been lost will not be for nothing.
I got a few words. There is no coincidences that right now that what we're experiencing as far as in our social shift is also happening within the midst of a pandemic. So we're forced to reevaluate, reimagine, and recreate our physical spaces and also our mental spaces right now. So 2 words that, I'm just going to kind of go forth with is dismantle. As we rebuild our mental spaces and also our physical spaces, what's dismantle? These 2 words, white supremacy. All right, let's create a new normal where all of our cultural experiences, all the cultural experiences of our students and our staff are represented in our educational spaces, and also empower. We want to reform curriculum, rebuild curriculum in a way that students can engage in it, in a way that we as educators, we have this paradigm that our responsibility is to empower our students. Our students already have the power. It's our responsibility to facilitate and create environments and create curriculum where the students can identify and tap into that power. So dismantle and empower are those 2 words.
So I think I'm going to finish, I think, with three words. Listen, empathize, and learn. We don't all have the same experiences. We don't have the same backgrounds. We don't have the same identity. So listen to others and empathize with their experiences, and learn. Learn how that impacts you, learn how that impacts them, learn how that changes the culture of our classrooms, and do better.
Well, I am deeply honored and humbled to be part of this conversation with such an amazing panel of passionate educators. A sincere thank you to all of the participants in today's roundtable discussion. We are now just scratching the surface of this work. We must resist the status quo. Racism can no longer be normal. It is our charge to push this work forward and truly be agents of sustainable change. We owe it to all of our students to do so. I would like to close today with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Where we have listened, now is our time to speak and rise and not be silent. Be well, my friends, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.